Do you hate the billionaires, the bankers and the bosses? Well, then you should be a communist.
The nuclear family is a total scam.
We are based on the invincible weapon of Marxist theory, so we can
And the reason so many people think that communism killed 100 million people directly has to do with American and Western pro-capitalist propaganda.
What it demonstrates is how leftists have won in education.
Do you think this is a real threat, or is it fringe enough to not materialize into anything?
Do you hate the billionaires, the bankers and the bosses? Well, then you should be a communist. This Thursday, the Leeds Revolutionary Communist Party is hosting a meeting at 5:30. In our meeting, we will be discussing why we've just launched a campaign for a revolution against the billionaires. We'll discuss the austerity that is being imposed by the Starmer government, whilst people are having to choose between heating or eating and the sick and disabled are being attacked further. The Starmer government is happy to spend billions on wars abroad. This is all a product of the capitalist system, a system that puts profit before people. Well, we say that the working class should expropriate the bankers, the billionaires and the bosses, and we should take power into our hands so that we can finally run society based on need and not profit. If you want to find out more, and if you want to find out why you should be a communist and you should join our revolution against the billionaires, then come along on Thursday at the Parkinson Steps.
Were you convinced?
I wasn't. I think what happens with a lot of these videos is that it's meant like basically to hook people in on a slogan, because when you are perpetually as an opposition movement, which is what these fringe parties are, you don't actually have to present a deep policy plan, right? So you can have slogans where expropriate the billionaires, take control of X, Y, and Z, and it's appealing to people who are ignorant, but the history of communism is where it's enacted at a state level is for it to happen is it has to be extremely tyrannical and authoritarian, and in many instances murderous and violent. So these videos, I know, are meant to be sort of cutesy, but like to me, because of my own family history, it's like I find it disturbing that young people, enough of them are drawn into this.
I think it's really great having your viewpoint here, because this is something I just didn't see a few years ago. People just being openly communists. And to me, it's just like saying, I'm a fascist. Come to our fascist march. Let's organize. We need to deport all the Jewish people and black people. To me, it's analogous to that. It's just the other side of the coin. But somehow we're in a time where just self-identifying as a communist is just totally fine.
What it demonstrates is how leftists have won in education, in higher education. So things that were taboo decades ago, taboo in the sense that socially there was a stigma attached to it, right? In the United States, it was anybody who was even tainted with being sympathetic to communism was, you faced ostracization for that. Now people don't bat an eye, they don't blink. Whereas if you call yourself conservative, like people find that offensive. What does that tell us about some of these about, I guess, most of the universities, that's the culture, the political culture there.
Yeah, and even if someone does disagree with the fact that you're saying you're a communist, I think a lot of them will go, they'll kind of view them as non-serious, kind of silly. They'll say, oh, well, let's say if like it's your daughter, they might say, oh, well, she's just going through a phase. Like lots of people have these phases. And that may be true. But if your son or daughter was like getting involved in a far right neo-Nazi group, even if it was a phase, you would not have that attitude of like, oh, he's just a bit crazy. It's just a bit, he's just being a bit of a rebel. Like, I think even when someone knows communism is ridiculous and doesn't work and causes harm, they'll still have this inclination to kind of downplay someone committing to it.
Yes.
The nuclear family is a total fucking scam. The nuclear family is a total fucking scam. Please allow me to bemoan that we're not supposed to be doing this alone. The nuclear family is a total fucking scam.
You could listen to that all night, right?
Yeah, something that can make my insomnia worse for once. My thinking of that is reaction to that is, it's a silly video, but there's a lot of people politically and professionally who have that ideology in view on families and life. And
yeah,
it's so, all the sociological data that's been gathered in the United States for decades about like positive outcomes for individuals, it correlates with being raised and brought up in a nuclear family. And I think it's become, for a while now, fashionable among progressives to bash the nuclear family, when all the other evidence shows negative outcomes for people growing up in non-nuclear families. So I'm a big defender of it as a gay man, and I think in one odd way I'm quite ideologically allied with traditionalists and conservative Christians in that regard, in that they see the value of marriage as an institution. And I used to be quite opposed to that. I saw it as in opposition to my identity. But the institution became an institution, and it was able to survive centuries through many, many different cultures. Because naturally, that's how families come together. And through data, we can see also, on average, that it does produce people who do better in life.
Yeah. I think they're kind of strongmanning what they would think is, let's say they actually agree with you in terms of the data. I suppose what you're seeing in terms of non-nuclear family children, they are sort of a product of a failed nuclear family rather than what these people have in their minds as a utopian community where it's purposefully set up to actually raise children as a commune, if you know what I mean. So it's not necessarily the same thing as a mother getting pregnant and her husband, effing off and her having to raise the baby alone. But I don't think they really understand what that would look like in practice. And, when it comes to communism and socialist ideas, I'd love to know your take on this because, there's a general consensus that these ideas don't work and they result in tyranny and death, which I agree with. But when you take, for example, Israel and their communities of, which I believe are called kibbutz, if I'm saying that correctly, and I'm still kind of new to learning about this, but, Douglas Murray has talked about them, where they're a very small community of people who live on a kind of, who have land, and they all own everything together in terms of what they produce and consume. And it seems like, at least for however few of them are left, that it seems to work in some cases. So I'm just wondering, can communism as an idea sort of work if it's a really small subset of people? It doesn't seem to work on a grand scale. But if you have a community of 100 people, do you think these ideas could possibly work?
Scale matters a lot, and that's overlooked by a lot of people who do sort of shallow analysis of social issues and solutions that they think might be solvable, right? For example, let's just look at something commercially, like lab-grown meat. Not that long ago, it was seen as potentially like a huge development in the meat industry, that we could grow meat from cells and duplicate the cells and grow it into sizable portions that can be sold commercially as a cruelty-free alternative to slaughtering animals. But the issue that has come up is like it's very resource intensive to grow the cells in a safe setting, right? It has to be super controlled, because otherwise, if the meat cells can grow easily and there's some contamination in it, you would grow pathogens as well. So it's been a huge scaling issue, and that's why it hasn't really worked commercially. You don't even really see it anymore. And in the products that advertise to have like a tiny percentage of it, and the rest is like gluten or some other soy or other meat alternatives that are mixed in. And that's an issue, I think, that, or maybe a way you can kind of understand how shared property owning can work. It can, I think, in some very small scales. You can argue that, a family operates kind of like a commune when things are shared together, right? And that works. Kibbutzes are not that big, but where this has been applied at a statewide level, it's been catastrophic, because it does work against, I think, people's evolved tendencies to have a sense of prioritizing their own family, and having a sense of what you work for and what you own is yours. And so to have a state from the top down work against that instinct that's in a lot of people, to make it enforced, you have to use force, and authoritarianism. And that's how you get the history of the 20th century.
Yeah, I find this so interesting, because I feel like when we talk about mass migration, there's such an angle I feel is missing, because I think you can almost frame it as a more important left-wing issue than right-wing issue. And what I mean by that is, if a society is going to have, functional left-wing policies like a welfare state and socialized healthcare, then it needs to be a high-trust society, and people need to feel like they're paying into a pot of people they trust, and also people who have an investment in the land that they occupy. So in terms of, if you're a left-wing person, in my opinion, the case against mass migration is really strong, and that's what they seem to miss. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
I do agree with it. I mean, up until it's been a more recent development that being against mass migration has been perceived as only a right-wing issue. I mean, it's an issue that the left traditionally cared about because of its impact on wages for workers, for example. If you flood a country with workers, it's going to suppress wages, right? It brings in a lot more competition for that. So it's an issue that traditionally a lot of leftists cared about. And then at some point, it became viewed as like a moral issue rather than an economic issue. And certain progressives and liberals operating from different set of ethos were able to successfully, I think, dominate the conversation about that, and sort of set what's now become almost difficult to question, because then you're seen, it's not seen as a policy disagreement. It's seen as you are seen as amoral to want to stop mass migration and want to remove people who are here illegally or illegitimately.
come from? It doesn't come from nothing. It doesn't come from thin air. It comes from basing ourselves on the history of our class, on the history of internationalism, and the unwavering faith in the ability of the working class to take power to liberate humanity. We are based on the invincible weapon of Marxist theory, so we can go out with confidence and build the Revolutionary Party to liberate the working class in Britain and all across the world. Long live the Antifa! Long live the Antifa! Antifa!
Yeah, this just really scares me, to be honest.
I mean, when I look at that, it makes me think of like Nazis and hooligans who have like similar political rallies at their fringe events. I think I mean, what does it say about the state of our societies that a lot of young people, a small number but significant enough, is drawn into these political ideologies, and not just in terms of passing support for some of the claims, but to join and to chant and to raise their fists up and also chant for Intifada. I just think about how like ignorant I was once upon a time, thinking, I mean, I remember as a child in school and learning about totalitarian regimes in history in Europe, and was just wondering, like, how did I just didn't understand how people could fall for it. Like, I thought, like, how could people support Nazism, or how could people support communism even? That was a secondary question I had later on, and I learned that very easily they can. And you see it happening in real time with these type of videos, right?
I'm just surprised how organized they are and official. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, they're very open, and their recruitment efforts are significant. I see them recruiting a lot, attempting to, in public, and they're true believers. So yeah, I think the fact that like people generally don't view what they're saying as like a political threat, they're kind of just ignored and downplayed as like silly people. But clearly, like, filling a whole room of people and showing the images of some pretty nasty people in history and doing it in a way to celebrate them.
I mean, look, this says hashtag Lenin, hashtag Trotsky. Like, as in, do you think do you think this is a real threat, or is it fringe enough to not materialize into anything?
I think they're fringe enough at the moment to not be a significant threat. It does seem that it appeals to a certain niche of sort of university adjacent and also communist boomers. And the numbers are small. We see them at all, these protest events and counter-protest type things. But in terms of like how effective have they been electorally, they haven't been, which I guess you could say is encouraging. I guess as an American, I view all of this as protected political speech, through my own sort of personal philosophy. I would be, where I would get really concerned is where they were more explicitly calling for people to carry out acts of violence or praising murderers and killers. And they're doing it in a sort of indirect way right now through sort of historical pictures and statements about Intifada, which they would say they interpret it differently than how others would interpret it. But you can see that it's a very radical ideology, that this is not...
What would be your understanding of Intifada?
Intifada were periods of violent unrest and terrorist attacks in Israel carried out by Palestinian nationalist militants, and they killed civilians, blew up children, targeted cafes and restaurants. So using that in the context of showing solidarity with Palestinian rights is showing solidarity for acts of terrorism against civilians.
Okay, Andy, last one.
So I'm a communist, and sometimes when I tell people that, they look really shocked and they go, "How can you be a communist? Communism killed 100 million people." And the reason so many people think that communism killed 100 million people directly has to do with American and Western pro-capitalist propaganda. One of the biggest sources for this claim comes from something called the Black Book of Communism, which has been debunked for a number of reasons, including being very anti-Semitic. But they are responsible for coming up with a figure of, I believe, 98 million people supposedly dead at the hands of communism. Now, a huge section of the deaths they attribute to communism have to do with the people that the USSR killed during World War II. And if you have even a passing cursory knowledge of history, that should set off a red flag. During World War II, the USSR was fighting the Nazis. And yes, the Black Book of Communism counts all of those Nazi deaths during World War II as victims of communism. That's why a couple of years ago in Canada, when victims of communism tried to build a memorial, the Canadian government had to put a stop to it because it turned out all the names they were listing included a bunch of dead Nazis. It's a real thing that happened, yeah. The truth is, these organizations, like Victims of Communism, are usually directly funded by people like the United States government. The United States government desperately wants us all to believe that capitalism is the only option. They're okay with us saying, yeah, capitalism is the worst, but it's all we got. Because the idea that there might be a better system of government that actually cares for people and takes care of them in a better capacity would cut into corporate profits. We can't have communism because it would make 12 super rich dudes not so rich anymore. So in the pursuit of trying to maintain capitalism's power over the entire planet, our government sets to work sending propaganda out as many places as we can to make us think that communism kills people.
She was actually very talented in what she was able to do, in that there were enough sort of nuggets of information that, and it's presented in such this peppy, cute way on TikTok with the funny pink hair that would draw in young people. And it's extremely insidious is what it's doing. It's making people numb to the atrocities of communism. And notice that she seemed to whitewash all of the deaths by saying that, well, since some of them were Nazis, I think the implication there were that the other people the other millions, tens of millions who died somehow deserved it, right? Or that they were Nazis by affiliation with some other thing. So it's used to justify mass atrocities without going into other examples that don't include Nazi victims, such as what happened in China or other mass killing programs where people died a lot in the Soviet Union. I think the Victims of Communism it's a laudable nonprofit. The people who have suffered a lot under communism, they're not seen as victims that are so. A lot of people don't view them as like worthy of sympathy anymore. I think because of the cultural takeover of the left to sort of whitewash communism generally, which you can see is emblematic in that video. And I even have noticed, or this is actually observable, with second generation immigrants to America, those who are the direct descendants, children of, let's say, parents who escaped communist regimes, there's like a softening that happens and they move to the left. I see that with Vietnamese Americans, for example. So the first generation, so like my parents' generation, the ones who moved to the United States were part of the diaspora, primarily from South Vietnam, who left to escape communism. And then their children, educated in the American systems and educated in American universities, become left-wing, socialist identifying, DSA identifying, progressive, and have a lot to say about the atrocities of fascist regimes, and are ignorant about even what happened to their own families. I see that a lot. It's a failure of education, and these short videos are so. It's how they're able to make such claims seem cute is actually quite disturbing to me. And I'm perhaps too old for TikTok, but when I see this type of content that's on there, and there's a lot of it, like also content that's treating certain terrorists as heroes and reading manifestos and like reading it as if to praise it. A lot of that's happened with revisionism around various jihadist ideologues.
It's the same with what you described as second generation immigrants. We're seeing that with Islamism too, because a lot of parents actually moved from more radical Islamist nations because they wanted a westernized society, but still wanted to retain some of their faith, and then their sons and daughters, or particularly their sons, are actually becoming Islamists in that country.
Oh, you're talking about the phenomenon of Western-born Muslims becoming more fundamentalist than their parents, right? Or their grandparents even.
Yeah, I just mean it's sort of analogous to what you described in terms of your parents flee communism and then your children actually are more sympathetic to it than less, which is what you'd expect. So it's sort of a similar thing there.
I think that, I don't know if that video went on a lot longer, but it was, I wonder if she talked about Pol Pot and what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia. Like they killed upwards of 20% of their own population, and these weren't Nazis who were killed. These were the educated, the middle class, who were forcibly moved from the cities to the countryside to do agriculture, and they died in those jungle settings, or they were killed, mass killed. And that's a country that's never recovered to date. Decades later, its population has never recovered. When you kill an entire strata of society who are educated or producing, it has like devastating consequences going on, and like the brutality of how people and children were killed. I wonder, like people have a lot to learn, when they visit like Auschwitz and other Holocaust memorials. I think people would have a lot to learn going to memorial sites for victims of communism. It's unsurprising that she was against a memorial being built in Canada.
Yeah, but we can't visit the gulags, right? My final comment is just, we have Holocaust denial, but do these people deny the gulags existed?
Some of them do, or some of what they say is quite similar to the arguments that various Holocaust deniers have, that it was exaggerated, or that it happened, but there were some good reasons for that. They use the same type of arguments for it.